And Carolyn, I think I saw Carolyn.
I'm on as well.
Ya podemos iniciar.
Sí, bueno, muy buenas tardes. Bienvenidos, bienvenidas a la audiencia número 4 de 180 periodo de sesiones de la Comisión Interamericana. Esta audiencia lleva por título La situación de los derechos humanos de las personas migrantes y personas privadas de libertad en Trinidad y Tobago. Es una audiencia que ha sido solicitada por el Centro Caribeño de Derechos Humanos de Trinidad y Tobago. Yo soy Yulisa Mantilla Falcón, primera vicepresidenta de la Comisión Interamericana, además de relatora para las personas migrantes sin movilidad humana. Me acompañan el comisionado Estuardo Ralón, relator de país, y la comisionada Margaret May Macaulay, relatora para los derechos de las mujeres. En esta oportunidad vamos a iniciar con la sociedad civil por 30 minutos, luego la comisión hará sus comentarios también por este espacio de tiempo, y posteriormente, nuevamente, la sociedad civil podrá participar por 30 minutos. Algunos aspectos de forma, es decirles que tenemos una herramienta digital para medir el tiempo, donde ustedes van a poder ver exactamente cuánto tiempo les queda. Contamos con interpretación bilingüe, con subtítulos, además que estas audiencias están siendo transmitidas por webcast y luego estarán en el canal de YouTube de la Comisión Interamericana. Quiero pedirles también que enciendan los micrófonos, que enciendan sus cámaras y apaguen sus micrófonos cuando no estén hablando. Dicho eso, entonces, empezamos con la sociedad civil, por favor, por 30 minutos. Les pido que se presenten y nos vayan indicando. Gracias.
Denise, can you start?
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to introduce my colleague, CCHR co-chair, Caribbean Center for Human Rights, co-chair Dr. Carolyn Gomes, and myself, Denise Pitcher, Executive Director of CCHR. On behalf of the Caribbean Center for Human Rights, we would like to thank the Organization of American States and the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights for this opportunity to highlight a very urgent situation facing migrants and persons deprived of their liberties in Trinidad and Tobago. We would like to express a heartfelt thank you to the lawyers, members of civil society who contributed to this report, and to the migrants who share their stories. This was a truly collaborative effort where multiple stakeholders were engaged in a desire to see the human rights space expanded so that each and every person is able to enjoy the rights that they are entitled to. Before we begin our presentation, we would like to acknowledge the efforts that the government of Trinidad and Tobago has engaged in to honor their international obligations with respect to migrants and refugees. The government of Trinidad and Tobago established a national registration process in June 2019, where 15,653 Venezuelans were registered over a 2-week period. This national registration allows Venezuelans to legally live and work in Trinidad and Tobago and is renewed on a 6-month basis. This is a tremendous humanitarian gesture that has allowed for the economic mobility, self-determination, and integration of migrants and refugees. However, there are several thousand more Venezuelans that were not able to register under this process, and there are over 30 other nationalities that seek asylum in Trinidad and Tobago and who were excluded from the national registration process. We note with great appreciation the statements made by the Minister of National Security, Fitzgerald Hines, and Prime Minister Keith Rowley to diffuse public hostility towards Venezuelan migrants and discourage attempts to blame the Venezuelan community for the surge in COVID cases. The announcement by the Prime Minister of the inclusion of migrants and refugees in the vaccination program is a positive step in ensuring the protection of this vulnerable population and mitigating the risks of the pandemic. The facilitation of voluntary repatriation flights to ensure safe and dignified return of Venezuelans wishing to return to Venezuela must also be commended. A pandemic does not mean that people cease to be in need of international protection. The crisis in Venezuela is ongoing, and it is reasonable to assume that persons would continue to seek international protection. It would therefore, these obligations were also noted by Prime Minister Keith Rowley in his statement in Parliament in 2016. He says, "It would therefore be remiss if an acknowledgement is not given to the possible effect that an increasingly unstable Venezuela will have on our own twin island nation state. However, the government will not be caught off guard in this situation, as domestic efforts to address the refugee situation in Trinidad and Tobago has been ongoing since the government of Trinidad and Tobago acceded to the 1951 Refugee Convention and 1961 Protocol of Refugees and Asylum Seekers. We are aware that if the situation deteriorates to the point of a flow of refugees out of Venezuela, that Trinidad and Tobago has obligations under international law. I'll now go into the context in Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidad and Tobago is a party, as mentioned, to the 1951 Refugee Convention and its 1967 Protocol. Trinidad and Tobago established a draft national policy to address refugee and asylum matters in 2014, but it remains in draft and has not been integrated into local legislation as yet. Trinidad is not a party to the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of Their Families. Currently, arrivals of migrants and refugees are treated under the 1976 Immigration Act, which lacks provisions to treat with asylum seekers and refugees and to address their particular vulnerabilities and needs. In the absence of domestic legislation and asylum procedures in Trinidad and Tobago, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees undertakes registration and refugee status determination. Under the draft refugee policy, a framework was established to provide guidance on how to treat asylum seekers and refugees. This draft policy outlines mechanisms to identify persons with legitimate claims and highlights the need for state officials to be trained to screen persons and identify specific needs. Despite no existing local refugee legislation, the Immigration Manual Volume 1 articulates quite clearly how migrants and refugees are to be treated and what rights they are entitled to, and establishes standard operating procedures. Further, a refugee unit has been established to treat migrants and refugees. So while no refugee legislation has been established, in practice, the government has undertaken efforts to implement elements of the refugee policy. Trinidad and Tobago continues to return migrants, which may constitute refoulement and violates our obligations under the convention and the right to asylum in the American Declaration of the Rights and Duties of Man. CCHR has received reports of multiple persons registered with UNHCR and or with the government have been returned. The default response of the government has been that these migrants are in breach of the Immigration Act and that our borders are closed to mitigate the risks associated with travel and in breach of our health ordinances, which have been established to protect public health. The Immigration Act does not recognize the non-penalization principle of the Refugee Convention. Generally, anyone found entering the country irregularly is charged with illegal entry, detained, and either released after a bond is paid and issued an order of supervision, or they are deported to their country of origin. This practice is not applied consistently, as some persons are returned while some are allowed to stay on an order of supervision. Border closures due to COVID-19 mean that all persons entering the country are branded as illegal, and the asylum process is further criminalized. The returns of migrants and asylum seekers is particularly concerning in the context of COVID-19. A report by Amnesty International describes state-run quarantine facilities in Venezuela as inhumane and a breeding ground for the spread of COVID-19. The recent report by the UN Human Rights Council, which accuses Venezuelan government officials of crimes against humanity, adds to the belief that persons are returned to a place where their lives and freedom are at risk. Persons that are deported from Trinidad and Tobago are often not allowed the opportunity to challenge the deportation orders, which is a violation of rights enshrined in Trinidad and Tobago's constitution. To highlight the human rights issues of migrants and refugees and persons deprived of their liberties in Trinidad and Tobago, we refer to the case of the deportations of 16 children and 9 women that took place in November 2020. This instance is by no means the exception, but indicative of systematic violations of human rights of migrants and refugees, and underscores the urgency for a legal framework to ensure the rights of migrants and refugees are protected. 16 children and 9 adult women were initially detained in a police jail on Tuesday, November 17th for irregular entry. The lawyer acting on their behalf submitted a letter for their release to the Chief Immigration Officer, which received no response. The lawyer received reports the following Saturday, November 21st, that they were going to be put on boats to be returned to Venezuela. A habeas corpus application was filed on Saturday evening and a hearing was set for Sunday. The lawyer later received reports early Sunday morning that the women and children were being removed from the jails and being taken to the port to be returned to Venezuela, despite the habeas corpus application, which was scheduled to be heard later that day. I just want to share, I would want to share a photo of I need to share my screen. Can I go ahead and share my screen?
Sí, por favor, si le autorizan para compartir pantalla.
This is a photo of the women and children being placed on the boats. Where is the screen? Okay, and then where is the photo? Can you see the photo? Yes? Okay. So this is the two boats that they were placed on. Okay, so let me stop share screen. I'm trying to expand my window. There's so many things open. Okay, stop share. When the hearing was called on Sunday, November 22nd, representatives for the Immigration Division were not present and the children were not presented as instructed. Confusion ensued as to who was responsible for taking the children to the boats. It was eventually revealed that the Coast Guard were the ones responsible. It should be noted that several persons that were placed on the boats had family members in Trinidad and Tobago who were not informed of the whereabouts of their family members. The boats were escorted by Trinidad and Tobago's Coast Guard out of Trinidad and Tobago's territorial waters on Sunday, November 22nd at 11 a.m. The judge on Sunday, 22nd November at midnight ordered that the children be produced by midday the next day. The lawyer for the state informed that the boat was escorted out of Trinidad's territorial waters and therefore the courts no longer had jurisdiction on the matter. The boat could not be located for around 48 hours and eventually made it back to Trinidad on November 24th, where the women and children were placed in jail cells. They were eventually transferred to the heliport in Chaguaramas, where they were detained until their release in January 2021. Several of the children in this matter, their fathers reside legally in Trinidad and Tobago. Either they are registered with the government or UNHCR. Therefore, the principle of family reunification applied. I just want to share another video. We have another video of where the children were placed in the jail cells. So. So, just bear with me. This particular case and the disjointed ad hoc response emphasizes the need for a legal framework that can establish a coordinated response that prevents placing vulnerable persons at further risk and upholds our international obligations and the law. For 2020, we recorded 745 persons deported and 611 persons detained. The majority were Venezuelans. The numbers may vary slightly. This number also only represents persons and not asylum seekers and refugees. With respect to immigration detention policies and procedures in Trinidad and Tobago are a grave concern for the Caribbean Center for Human Rights. Because of the lack of a legal framework to treat refugees and lack of screening mechanisms, migrants are charged with illegal entry in violation of the non-penalization principle. They are often held for indefinite periods without sufficient legal basis and for periods beyond what is considered reasonable. Persons have been held in immigration detention for months and even years. This contradicts the guidelines articulated in the draft refugee policy, which states that persons may not be held for more than 10 days without sufficient legal basis. There is currently a Nigerian national who has been held in the Immigration Detention Center for the past 8 years. Asylum seekers receive little support or guidance from the state as to their rights. The immigration detention facility at Aripo has been described by detainees as unsanitary and inhumane, and there have been a number of protests by detainees about the conditions. The conditions in remand are also incredibly inhumane, and there is severe overcrowding. Such conditions create a breeding ground for the spread of the COVID-19 virus and other diseases, which threaten detainees' right to health and right to life. So I just have one more video that I'm going to share of the center in Aripo.
Para que se escuche tendrías que compartir. You have to share also the sound. But
we can take you through this, Commissioner, in terms of what they're saying.
Okay.
Okay, and now I'll hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Carolyn Gomes, for the rest of our presentation.
Just very briefly before I start, Denise, could you stop the screen share?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, apologies, and I hope you're seeing me. Just very briefly before we start, just to explain that in that video, it's actually a native Spanish speaker speaking in English, complaining about the detention conditions, complaining about the overcrowding, saying that they're human beings, they just want a chance to live and work, and they're detained in there. They haven't had any opportunity to get out of there. They don't know when they're going to get out of there. They're overcrowded. They get 1 hour a day to be outside for 1 hour in a 24-hour period, and there is no clarity on when they will be allowed out. And they also point to a gentleman in the cell that you don't see very well, but they say this is the Nigerian gentleman who has been here for 8 years. We don't know what is going on. You'll also notice in the video that there are several persons in the video who look younger than 18. We don't have any confirmation of their ages, but there are a number of them that look like adolescents. I'd like to tell you a little bit and expand on this question of children in detention. We have received several reports that women and children are not separated from male detainees in those detention facilities. And migrant children often share spaces with other adults. I think you would have seen some of that on the brief video Denise showed. Of particular concern is that children have also been held at the Shagaramas detention facility for extended periods, which violates the best interests of the child principle. Delivering a decision at the hearing in the case of the 16 children, Justice Joan Charles noted that Trinidad and Tobago's immigration laws and policies do not provide any guidance for the detention and deportation of children. I'd like to bring to the Commission's attention a recent judgment from the Privy Council Privy Council Appeal number 0112 of 2019, Commissioner of Prisons and others, versus CPASAD and another appellants from Trinidad and Tobago. The Privy Council at paragraph 75 made the following finding. Fundamentally, the executive brought into operation the material provisions of the Children Act without having first put in place the arrangements necessary to give effects to their mandatory requirements in a context where the intended beneficiary cohort of these measures, namely children, had been identified by both international law and domestic law as deserving of special protection. This had a series of substantial consequences. The operation of several interrelated provisions of primary legislation were rendered impotent during a protracted period. The aforementioned cohort was deprived of the benefits and protections prescribed by the legislature. International norms were violated. The appellants were thereby exposed to conditions, environments, and influences which the frustrated legislative provisions were designed to avoid. The Chief Magistrate was compelled to make a series of unlawful remand orders. The appellants were deprived of their liberty pursuant to such orders, and the legal systems of Trinidad and Tobago did not provide them with timeous and efficacious remedies. While this judgment was rendered in an appeal involving Trinidadian nationals, it is equally applicable to the situation of migrant children in Trinidad and Tobago. That children are deserving of special care and protection in all circumstances is not in dispute. That Venezuelan migrant children are not receiving that special care and protection is also not in dispute. The failure of the state to provide the resources and arrangements required to give effect to its own laws and obligations has the effect of exposing all children to conditions, environments, and influences which violate their rights. There's also a real concern about the lack of transparency in the operation of these detention centers. CCHR submitted a Freedom of Information request in September 2020, seeking information on the procedures and protocols with respect to immigration detention. We have yet to receive a response from the Immigration Division, which is a breach of the Freedom of Information Act. There's a lack of transparency by the government with respect to monitoring of conditions in immigration detention. Independent bodies and civil society actors have not been allowed access to immigration detention facilities, and this predates the pandemic, so it's not a consequence of the pandemic. CCHR is particularly concerned about the COVID health protocols in immigration detention. We also had a recent report of an asylum seeker contracting COVID-19 whilst in immigration detention. As you would have seen from the video, there is no separation in that detention facility that we showed you. Additionally, when persons are deported, there have been instances where everybody is placed on the same vessel together, irregardless of where they were staying, irregardless of quarantine, COVID testing. Nothing is known about the people next to them on the boat when they are deported. Orders of supervision serve as an alternative to detention, but that practice is applied inconsistently and requires the payment of a bond, which many migrants are unable to pay. We have received reports that there are 10 children currently in detention who will not be released before the bond is paid, and the families are scrambling to gather that bond together. And this is in fact a violation of the non-penalization principle. The situation in immigration detention facilities in Trinidad and Tobago remains an urgent one, given the inhumane conditions, the lack of transparency by the government, detention of persons for indefinite periods, the criminalization of the asylum process, the lack of information on the policies and procedures of immigration detention, and the detention of children in breach of the government's obligation to provide special care for them. We have a number of other cases that we would refer to. We won't use them this hearing, but certainly are happy to provide information to the Commission on the specifics. We have one so I'll talk you through a little bit the situation, why some of the delays. The Trinidad and Tobago Constitution states that everyone has access to a fair trial, yet far too often persons are deported without having an opportunity to challenge their deportations or the lack of hearing of their asylum claims. As the cases involving the 16 children and highlight, obtaining access to justice and the right to due process is very difficult for migrants and refugees. There are several features of the process of seeking asylum through the courts in Trinidad and Tobago which make it difficult for asylum seekers to claim their rights. Multiple adjournments are a feature of Trinidad and Tobago's criminal justice system, not just the immigration hearings or habeas corpus hearings. It's a feature of the court system, which result in long delays between hearings and a detention period pending asylum application determination of months, if not years, and frustration. And many persons abandon their applications because they're stuck in detention, waiting a hearing over prolonged periods, and sometimes think it's better they just get on another boat and get deported back to Venezuela. These delays and multiple adjournments result in the denial of rights of migrants and refugees. Effectively, these delays and multiple adjournments and the conditions in which they are kept in detention pending determination of their cases threaten not only their right to health and the right to a hearing within a reasonable time, and their right not to be arbitrarily detained without a legal basis, on occasion threaten their right to life. Many of the deportation challenges end up in the High Court, and migrants and refugees lack the resources and skilled legal representation to substantively challenge state actions against them. Lack of a consistent policy and expertise in the application of that policy, lack of familiarity with human rights and international law at all levels of the legal fraternity, including the judiciary, means that migrants and refugees have limited opportunity for justice in the courts of Trinidad and Tobago. I want to touch now a little bit on human trafficking. According to a recent report by Connectus, an international center for journalists, 21,000 Venezuelan women and girls have been trafficked into Trinidad and Tobago in the last 6 years. Trinidad and Tobago is a signatory to the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Crime and its protocols, and it has established the Trafficking in Persons Unit and a Trafficking in Persons Act to investigate cases of trafficking. In spite of local legislation and the establishment of the Counter-Trafficking Unit, where significant resources have been expended, human trafficking networks have exploded in relation to the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, which has seen increased flows of vulnerable persons who are lured by traffickers on false promises of jobs. Many of these vulnerable women end up working in brothels. The US State Department in 2020, its 2020 Trafficking in Persons report has maintained its Tier 2 ranking of Trinidad and Tobago due to its inability to meet the minimum standards to combat human trafficking. The report actually links government officials to trafficking in persons. A 2019 CARICOM report linked the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service to human smuggling and trafficking rings between Venezuela and Trinidad and Tobago. Prime Minister Keith Rowley has indicated that stiffer penalties are imminent and there's recognition that gaps still exist in the legislation. However, much more must be done to curb these very serious human rights issues. Very few persons have been charged and prosecuted for this crime, and not a single government official or police officer has been charged. Who ends up being charged and detained are usually the persons who were trafficked in raids on the brothels where they're working, and they can spend months and years awaiting deportation without access to victim services and without being able to access places and persons to whom they can report what was done to them. And in fact, we've received reports from victims of trafficking who have complained that there's been limited or no follow-up of their cases. This reality will discourage others from coming forward, as the laws are not being enforced to match the scale of the issue. Additionally, victims are reluctant to report their situation for fear of being targeted because of the involvement, which many of them are aware of the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service in human smuggling and trafficking. Combating human trafficking should be a priority because it's a major factor in increasing the irregular flow into Trinidad and Tobago and placing vulnerable persons at risk. We also want to report very quickly an increase in the gender-based violence and the susceptibility of these trafficked women and girls, as well as the general population of persons fleeing from Venezuela to gender-based violence. They're vulnerable to sexual exploitation, threats from those who employ them, that if they don't provide sex, they will report them or deport them. And the community itself has seen an increase in gender-based violence. Another issue that is of concern to us is the lack of access for migrant children to schooling. The children are not eligible to attend government schools. There is a program that is attempting to educate them, which the government is collaborating with, and it's delivered a collaboration of UNHCR, CR, the UNICEF, and implementing partner Living Water Community. In December 29.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, we are over the time. Estamos fuera del tiempo. Quizás en la segunda ronda podemos continuar, por favor. Sí. Muchísimas gracias.
Okay.
En la segunda ronda. Lo que pasa es que el reloj se reinició y entonces empezó. Sorry, the clock was, you know, we're over the time. We finished the time,
okay.
But the part you can follow with the time, the things. Ahora me gustaría, por favor, darle la palabra a los comisionados y comisionadas. Iniciaría con el comisionado Estuardo Ralón, relator de país, por favor.
Muchas gracias, presidenta. Buena tarde. Muy buena tarde también a la comisionada Margaret. Y quisiera también saludar y dar una cordial bienvenida al Centro Caribeño de Derechos Humanos. Y quiero decir que estoy impactado por las imágenes que ustedes han mostrado, por el detalle de denuncias de conductas totalmente violatorias de derechos humanos en el tema relacionado al enfoque que se le ha dado tanto a migración como a una privación de libertad sanitaria y algunas condiciones inhumanas sobre las cuales son afectados tanto menores de edad como personas que están en una situación de migración que por necesidad han tenido que salir de sus países. Y como ustedes bien saben, en la Comisión Interamericana hay una, digamos, una manera de organización en la cual se hace un encargo específico a algunos comisionados, tanto de país como de algunos temas. Y en mi caso, soy el relator del país para Trinidad y Tobago y también soy relator de la temática de personas privadas de libertad y de combate a la tortura. Esta información que ustedes hoy en estos minutos nos han mostrado, pues denota un trabajo muy detallado de recopilar una lamentable situación que se está dando en Trinidad y Tobago y que el haberse podido dar esta audiencia visibiliza de una manera muy importante. Y yo invitaría a que cualquier información, ya sea los videos, los documentos, algún informe que ustedes hayan trabajado y que todavía no haya sido enviado a la comisión, no lo puedan trasladar. De hecho, pediría el apoyo de la Secretaría Ejecutiva, si en el mismo chat de esta audiencia puede poner la dirección o hacia dónde nos pueden hacer llegar esa importante información. Lamento que no estén los representantes del Estado. Esta audiencia estaba considerada para que pudieran estar tanto la la organización peticionaria de sociedad civil como el Estado, porque este mecanismo sirve precisamente no solo para visibilizar la situación, sino que el Estado tenga la oportunidad de reaccionar no solo a lo comentado, sino en alguna mejora o en alguna línea de implementación de alguna política pública o revertir determinada situación. Como relator de país, yo voy a trasladar un comentario cuando haya la oportunidad con el pleno de la comisión de que pudiéramos darle seguimiento a este tema, es decir, que no se quede en esta audiencia y muy posiblemente que podamos quizás, como nos lo permite nuestro reglamento, enviar una carta al Estado con una serie de preguntas donde, digamos, después de interpretar cada una de la información que usted nos ha dado, le podamos preguntar al Estado sobre situaciones y que nos dé insumos, no solo para pronunciarnos, sino acercarnos a la autoridad, también desde un enfoque de eventualmente ofrecer asistencia técnica para la mejora de aspectos relacionados a eliminar conductas de criminalización en ciertos procesos, en detenciones arbitrarias y en condiciones totalmente degradantes, inhumanas, a los que incluso menores de edad están sufriendo. Acá está con nosotros pues quien preside hoy esta audiencia, la comisionada Mantilla, que seguramente hará un abordaje muy detallado desde un enfoque de la relatoría de migrantes que está a su cargo y seguramente la disposición de poder trabajar en forma conjunta, tanto relatoría de país, relatoría temática, pero quiero dejar en el ambiente que digamos, anotamos esa gravedad, esa urgencia, no quedará en esta audiencia, sino trasladaremos al Pleno alguna línea de acción que nos permita dar seguimiento y de alguna manera que en el marco de competencias de la Comisión podamos incidir en que se detengan algunas conductas completamente violatorias a derechos humanos y que progresivamente se vaya mejorando en aplicación de las correctas políticas públicas con un enfoque de respeto a derechos humanos. Así que felicitar por el trabajo de la organización del Centro Caribeño, por venir muy preparados a la reunión y traernos información impactante, pero muy completa, muy detallada, que nos da una mirada de la situación crítica que está dándose en Trinidad y Tobago. Así que quedamos a las órdenes. Muchas gracias, presidente.
Muchas gracias, comisionado. Le doy la palabra a la comisionada Macaulay, relatora de los derechos de las mujeres.
I am trying to get my I hope you can hear me. I've been fiddling with the interpretation back and forth. Before I start, I have to say a special hello to Caroline. This is disgusting. We live in the same city, and this is how we're seeing each other. This is awful. Anyway, it's good to see you and hear you. I wish it was on some other issue. And nice to meet you, Denise. And thank you all who are present and thanks the two of you for your absolutely comprehensive report, which is extremely concerning for all the rapporteurships present here today, and also for the rapporteurship on economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights. I'm sure we'll have some concern on this, and there she is. And Soledad, I didn't know you were here. Thank goodness you're here. And also the rapporteur on children's rights, my very good friend Esmeralda, who we shall also report to. In fact, what my brother Strada has said about the Article 18 letter inquiring us putting specific questions to the state, that letter would come from all the relevant rapporteurships, it must do. But I have to say that I personally, I'm not really surprised about what you've reported about the state of the detention areas, because we had a public hearing with former Commissioner Rosemary Antoine on the state of the prisons and the operations of the courts some time ago. I can't remember if Lisa, you and Strado were here, but if so, I'm not sure whether you were on that panel. And they informed us of the extraordinary delays in legal processes of matters going to court, which have to do with the rights of people, and persons being waiting for trial for 9, 10 years and things like that. So I wasn't really surprised at this, but I thought that there would have been some improvement after the recommendations we made. And seemingly not, because if their own citizens awaiting trial in the criminal courts can be treated that way, it's not surprising they're treating those they consider strangers in their country badly. But one would have thought that when it comes to women and children who are escaping very difficult conditions in their home state and are looking for assistance and refuge, they would in fact apply all the international norms and standards and regulations and laws which apply in such circumstances. And clearly not. So we will have to act. I am very happy that you gave the numbers about the women trafficked, Venezuelan women trafficked, because this is information which I was unaware of and will pass on to my specialist in my rapporteurship, so that we can delve into it much deeper. So I'm asking you if you could give us all the information you have in that regard, so that we can deal with them specifically. And also all information that you have about sexual violations of women, especially those which they are imposed upon them in their workplace. Those who are lucky enough to be there and to have work, for them to be under duress, sexual favors is egregious. So if we can have some more information on that as well. And also, of course, all the information you have relating to children, the violation of children's rights, so that our sister Commissioner Esmeralda could have those in her rapporteurships, I don't think, as Strado said, he has mentioned the mechanisms we can use immediately to that. But of course, we cannot force the state to attend, even though we do make comments about their failure to attend such public meetings, being not in the spirit of what one expects of state parties to the inter-American system. Because it is not helpful when the states are not present. But we will do what we can. Certainly from the women's rapporteurship, we will do that. And do you have any specific information as to Afro-descendant Venezuelans, Afro-Venezuelans? If you do, please send those to us as well, because I'm the rapporteur for Afro-descendants' rights and against discrimination. So with that, thank you very, very much. And Caroline, I'm going to call you. Yes.
Muchas gracias.
Yes,
Okay.
I can't. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Muchas gracias, comisionada, por su presentación. Antes de darle la palabra a la relatora, como decía el comisionado, yo soy relatora para personas en movilidad humana. En ese sentido también hago mío las palabras del comisionado Ralón. Hubiera sido muy importante la presencia del Estado, sobre todo para poder conversar y poder ver posibilidades de acción en este tema. Quería recordar cómo ya hay un marco normativo, más allá de los tratados, sino dentro de lo que son las normas imperativas del Jus Cogens, contra la discriminación. Y la situación que estamos viviendo y que estamos viendo que ustedes nos traen es una situación totalmente de discriminación contra un grupo, en este caso las personas venezolanas y migrantes, ¿no? En ese sentido, solo recordar cómo tenemos ya los principios interamericanos, la resolución 4/2019, que establece una serie de ideas, medidas, principios en sí mismos, que por los videos y la información que ustedes traen no están siendo cumplidos. Adicionalmente, tenemos la resolución 2/2018 para el caso de las personas refugiadas venezolanas, y tenemos la resolución 1/2020 que se dio específicamente para el tema durante la pandemia, ¿no? Y teníamos, y en eso sí voy a ser muy enfática, las dificultades que ya preexistían y que ustedes nos comentan, se han incrementado con estos hacinamientos y estas afectaciones a los derechos. La Comisión está muy al tanto de la situación, por eso fue que conseguimos la resolución 93/20, las medidas cautelares en el caso concreto de 6 niños y niñas que habían sido deportados de Trinidad y Tobago. Y en ese sentido también agradecemos la información que nos dan, porque como yo les decía, es una resolución sobre personas migrantes y personas en movilidad humana, que incluyen personas desplazadas, personas que buscan asilo, y que tiene una visión diferenciada. Toda esa información que ustedes han presentado, por favor, les vamos a pedir que nos la hagan llegar, y sin duda con el comisionado Ralón y la comisionada Macaulay vamos a ver los mecanismos para obtener las respuestas y la información que el Estado nos pueda dar en ese sentido. Queremos también expresar la gratitud por la información que nos han dado, y además toda esta continuidad de violencia, como ustedes establecían, está totalmente comprobado cómo muchas mujeres y niñas escapan de sus países, en este caso de Venezuela, no solo por la situación general de violación de derechos humanos, sino por la violencia de género. Y llegar a espacios de hacinamiento, donde seguramente van a seguir sufriendo agresiones, estamos viendo el tema de la salud sexual y reproductiva, la violación sexual, los niños y niñas nacidos producto de esa violación. Es realmente una situación muy grave que tomamos en cuenta de todas maneras. Gracias nuevamente, y le voy a dar la palabra a la relatora redesca Soledad García.
Gracias, Presidenta. Muy brevemente también para agradecer, como lo señalaba la comisionada Margaret, hay muchos temas en esta audiencia que suscitan la preocupación del mandato. Es una situación muy dramática y les felicito por el trabajo que realmente hacen por estas personas que tanto sufren, y es especialmente dramática por darse en tiempos de pandemia. Ya la comisionada Mantilla ponía sobre la mesa la resolución 1/2020 de la Comisión. También hay 2 resoluciones muy importantes en este caso aplicables al contexto de pandemia, que es la 4/2020 de personas con COVID-19, y los videos que ustedes nos enseñaban de hacinamiento de mujeres, niños, niñas y personas privadas de libertad, hombres privados de libertad, pues hacen fácilmente sospechar la facilidad con que se contagia el virus. Así que por favor ténganlo en cuenta, como también la resolución 1/2021, que es sobre la vacunación contra el COVID-19, donde la Comisión llama enfáticamente a no discriminar en la vacunación contra el COVID-19, específicamente por razones de movilidad humana. También toda la disponibilidad desde el mandato y el interés en recibir mayor información, la preocupación por esta falta de protocolos de salud que ustedes mencionaban, y también sería muy interesante y necesario saber cuál es la situación en cuanto al derecho al agua, en cuanto al derecho a la alimentación, la educación de esos niños y niñas que están en condiciones de detención. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchas gracias, relatora. Le devuelvo la palabra a la sociedad civil, a Denise y a Caroline, para que puedan contestar y comentar, ¿no? Por media hora, 30 minutos.
Thank you so very much for the reception and for hearing us and for acknowledging what we are telling you about the conditions and our worry about what's happening. I first want to thank Commissioner Stuardo for his talking about a letter to the states. We have a few other recommendations that I'll indulge your time and your patience to just put on the table for the commission. Clearly our report sets out things that are wrong and that things that need to change. And it highlights the need for the international community to be in solidarity with Trinidad and Tobago, because this is not a situation that it's overwhelming to the authorities, but it's also overwhelming in other places in the Caribbean. So we would want the international community to support Trinidad to implement and to uphold its own obligations. And so we would really ask, in addition to the letter, if it would be possible for the Commission to actually have a visit to Trinidad and Tobago to see for yourselves the situation, to meet with the authorities, to help work with them to see what can be done and where the assistance can come from. But we would also ask, when you write to the state, if you could ask them about this draft policy since 2014, because it needs finalization and it needs implementation. It has a draft policy to address refugee and asylum matters, but because it's not gone beyond draft, it does not allow for coordination. It doesn't allow for clear implementation, clear standards, clear accountability from the people who have to do the work to look after and address the situation of migrants and refugees. And so we'd also ask you if you could talk to the state about training for the officers on their duties and accountabilities under a finalized policy. And request the state to establish a working group with civil society and government, as well as relevant international agencies, for the implementation of this policy. So finalize it, train on it, but also ask the state to coordinate with local and international stakeholders to ensure that it's implemented with clear lines of responsibility and accountability for all stakeholders. And there are a lot of stakeholders: the Coast Guard, the Trinidad and Tobago Defense Force, the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service, the Immigration Division, the Prison Service, the Health Services, the Children's Services in Trinidad and Tobago, the courts, the judiciary. We need to have a coordinated effort from all of those who are going to have to play a part in ensuring that the protections are afforded right across the board in a manner that upholds Trinidad's international obligations. We'd also ask you to request the state to undertake public education combating xenophobia and highlighting refugees' rights and protections, outlining how and to whom citizens may raise concerns about illegal migration and trafficking in persons. Who do they talk to? Who do they report to? As well as how and from whom migrants can claim asylum and report breaches of their rights. We'd request the Commission if you can work to facilitate and coordinate a regional and international approach to the issues of migrants and refugees, particularly those from Venezuela, but this in the Caribbean. Suriname, Guyana, Aruba, Curacao, a number of the smaller islands up the Caribbean chain struggle with the number of refugees from Venezuela, struggle with upholding their international obligations. We certainly would benefit from some coordination leadership of the effort to support these countries who very often want to do the right things but are overwhelmed. So the policy is important and its implementation and the training. I'd also ask if there can be a dialogue with the government of Trinidad and Tobago about moving expeditiously to develop and pass a comprehensive immigration law that codifies how the state will fulfill its international obligations to migrants and refugees while protecting and enforcing its control over immigration into its territory. A law supersedes a policy, and a law such as this would give the state the ability to screen persons entering the country and identify persons in need of protection, would give it a status and a standing and a structure that would allow the state to know exactly how to protect migrants and refugees from exploitation and abuse, how to support efforts to combat trafficking, smuggling, and other criminal activities, and facilitate migrant workers' entry into the labor force. Trinidad is not in a vacuum, and that's why we are here today with you. It exists in a global community, in which there are expectations of adherence to standards and norms, and from which assistance is available and could be utilized to ensure that the state fulfills its commitments. And so we at CCHR urge the Commission to enter into a dialogue with the state. We hope they will, because we have in good faith outlined for you the measures that they have taken to try and remedy the situation, that they are not enough, that they are not strong enough, and that they still result in rights abuses. There are still rights abuses ongoing. Perhaps Trinidad and Tobago could benefit from the reassurance of the support and intention of the Commission to help them. Denise, I don't know if you want to add anything.
No, I think Carolyn has done a tremendous job at outlining all the recommendations, that we hope that the government will take heed. I do have some photos that I can share with respect to the conditions in the prisons, because migrants and refugees, they are held in remand and in maximum security prisons, and they're charged for irregular entry. And they're being housed with criminals that have committed more serious offenses. So it's extremely disturbing, and that they're held indefinitely. One more point to touch on is that currently in immigration detention, communication is cut off. Immigration detainees are not able to communicate with anyone outside. We receive that information from lawyers acting on their behalf. And that violates their rights. They're supposed to be afforded the right to have communication, to communicate with friends, family members, legal representatives, etc. So I will just share. Let me just find the document to show the conditions which have been incredibly, the conditions in prisons are incredibly inhumane. Since the last hearing, I think things may have gotten worse if it has remained unchanged. And persons in remand in particular as well too, they're severely frustrated. So let me just share screen. Can you all see the photo? So these were sent by or circulated on social media by remandees. So basically this one is showing where remandees have to urine through their gates into the drains, and of course they're exposed to those smells and conditions. It's incredibly inhumane. This one, it's their food remanded, and this was an instance where they were in protest, and they went on a hunger strike, protesting against COVID restrictions and the inhumane conditions, and so they left their food outside. Again, another one showing where the food sharing, right where, so this is the area where the food is being distributed, and these are all the drains here as well too, where they urinate, and these are the conditions that they are living in. I think, yeah, those are the three photos. But yeah, the situation in remand is particularly cruel and inhumane. Also, there were measures, the Attorney General in early 2020 announced measures to reduce the risk of COVID in prisons by releasing, by saying that he's going to release non-violent persons that committed minor offenses. When in fact, very few persons have been released. So the prison population still remains at the same levels that it has been since the start of the pandemic. There have been spikes in remand in the prisons with respect to the inmates and also prison officers. And I'm not sure if you all are familiar with what's happening in Trinidad and Tobago, but we have a serious surge in Trinidad and Tobago. Now it's sort of stabilizing, but we do have the Brazilian variant, and it's dominating, or it's beginning to dominate the number of cases. And that's going to be a serious situation for persons in immigration detention and prisons. And what's also concerning is that vulnerable persons, both migrants and refugees and persons in prisons, they have compromised health conditions, and they don't have proper nutrition. They don't get proper nutrition that can support their immune systems. They have compromised immune systems. So all of these things threaten their right to life, their right to health, and are extremely disconcerting and warrant urgent action. I'm not sure if Carolyn wants to add anything to that.
Sorry, mute button. No, I don't want to add anything more. I think the conditions have been dreadful for a long time. The overcrowding has been worsened by COVID. The risks have been worsened by the COVID, and the overcrowding has not lessened. We are using penitentiaries across the region that were built in the 1800s and are unfit for purpose. And then we are stacking people one on top of another in cells built for far less of a crowd. And then our court systems work inefficiently. So people are kept on remand for years for offenses that they are not convicted of. So it warrants urgent attention. And certainly we would be grateful for the attention of the commissioners.
Thank you. Como tenemos tiempo, la comisionada Macaulay.
Hello?
Yes. We have time.
Thank you, Vice President. Thank you. Yes, I wanted to ask in relation to sanitizing materials, whether the government provides that and sufficiently in the remand centers and the prisons and lockups, and also. Yeah, I thought about something else. And also, does Venezuela still have a consulate there? A consulate office there? Yes?
Yes, so yes, that there is a consulate.
They're not permitted to even make calls to the consulate?
Venezuelans do go to the consulate, but the thing about it is some of these asylum seekers and refugees are hesitant to.
Yes.
Sorry.
I understand. Will not
Right.
want to make contact, but
Exactly.
some might, in desperation. Some might.
Yes. Currently, because of the pandemic and the loss of jobs, a number of them are applying or are working with the Venezuelan consulate to return, and the government of Trinidad and Tobago are trying to facilitate these repatriations.
And I wanted to ask Caroline, I'm not sure that you mentioned the thing about the complicity of police officers in trafficking of women. But I don't think you mentioned it as one of the things you're asking the commission to do. I'm sure you would want us to ask the government to investigate that and use all due diligence that they should in that regard.
Absolutely, and thank you for raising this, Margaret. It is we really need to strengthen both the units and that it has been established and resource it, but we also need to strengthen the investigation of these reports, including the one done by by the US and also CARICOM, because we need to use the intelligence that these women are prepared to give, but will only give in a protected space, a space where they can be assured is not going to go back and not going to, and their response has been, in far too many instances, an arrest of the persons they find in the brothel, a shutdown for a temporary period of the brothel owners, and a reopening in 2 weeks while the women, with a different set of girls, while the women who they picked up remain in remand or in detention.
Gracias.
And the trafficking is not limited.
Yes.
Apologies.
No, don't worry about it. I mean, we have time, so this is not what we usually do, but we have time, and it was very important for us to listen to you. Well, I'd like to finish this hearing saying thank you again for the information. I think that's a very good thing that we are the rapporteur of women, migrant rapporteur, country rapporteur, and the social economical right rapporteur. And I like to say something that I was thinking when Caroline talked about how Trinidad y Tobago no está sola, sino que está dentro de todo del mundo y es parte de este sistema interamericano, desde que eres parte de los estados de la OEA. Tengan claro y tengan muy presente que la Comisión expresa su mayor compromiso, como vicepresidenta también lo digo, y que vamos a tomar especial nota de los acuerdos, de los pedidos, para poder seguir trabajando de modo que este tema sea visibilizado permanentemente. Gracias nuevamente por su enorme trabajo. Y recogemos además de su trabajo la esperanza, porque si están aquí es porque tienen esperanza y la Comisión no va a defraudar esa esperanza. Muchísimas gracias, declaro cerrada la audiencia, que tengan buenas tardes. Hasta luego.